I can't see the chat, so just stop me if there's something that we need to discuss. But as Jill said, this is kind of our introduction to generative AI in teaching. And even if we're a little bit familiar with it, I think it can be helpful to return to some of the fundamental aspects of this technology, since we're going to have to talk with students about this as well this semester. And our students are coming to this with the same broad range of students who've been using it a lot, students who maybe have used it a little bit, and those who have maybe stayed away from it. And the way that we talk about this technology with students, can be really helpful to creating that culture of transparency in class around how we're going to use it, if at all, in class, and what our expectations are with regards to this tool and learning, academic integrity, and other issues. There's a few maxims that we like to have for these conversations. We're all approaching this from different positions. We have a lot of people in the Zoom room. There's different disciplines that have different things at stake when it comes to the development of this technology. We all personally have different positions on how this technology works, what the implications are, what it means for us as scholars. The thing about the tools is that they're changing. And so the things that we're talking about today more or less have stayed the same throughout the past few months, but they may change. And there's aspects of them that we'll talk about as examples that do change. And so it's okay that they're a little bit different. And it's something to keep in mind as we think about how we might use them in our teaching, so that they are always changing. And the pace is, of course, very fast. I've said that already. And I want to note that the discourse, so the conversation around AI, is increasingly crowded with perspectives. And it can sometimes feel like, we sort of need to kind of get with those perspectives, or that we need to kind of respond to those perspectives. But really, we all can take our time to negotiate our own perspectives and uses for generative AI.
I find myself often panicking about the need to consume all that is written about AI. And Trey often kindly reminds me that we should be invited to approach this at a human pace. That is what we bring to the table as academics and as thinkers. And so we invite you to do the same.
And the last thing I'll just say is that the ethics and impact of use are still very much being discovered at this moment. And we'll talk about ethics here in just a second. So as a sort of framing or a level setting moment, I should say, there's this term artificial intelligence that kind of gets thrown around with all of this, and it can mean lots of different things. I was on a panel a couple of months ago with someone who, like when it was their turn to speak, the first thing they talked about was the Terminator franchise, the movies and Skynet. And that's kind of a motif in lots of science fiction, is this idea of an artificial intelligence that is to such a degree of sophistication, it essentially is a human-like entity or agent that can make its own decisions, that can move through the world, understand things, reason, know things, etc., behave as if it were a human. And this is kind of the notion of artificial general intelligence, or AGI. That's not necessarily what we're talking about when we talk about generative artificial intelligence, or Gen AI, which is based on machine learning and natural language processing. Generative, as it suggests, it's making something. So that's kind of one of the big differences between this AI and previous versions. But it's based off of machines learning patterns in vast amounts of data. If you imagine to take the internet as it exists right now and just copy and paste the entire internet into a one Word document, and then have a computer study that Word document to understand patterns in language, try to learn as much about words as it can by looking at that document. And that's a very super basic way of kind of explaining how these language models have been trained on different sources. And if a thought that just went through your head is that, hey, the internet doesn't sound like the greatest thing to train things on when it comes to language, then you're not alone, and that's one of the concerns that we can continue to talk about. So with generative artificial intelligence, it understands patterns in language for the text-based generators, for the visuals. It's studied images that are available as well. And it can take a prompt that the user enters and try to reproduce to a degree of statistical likelihood based on its learning, a plausible output to some user response. So what's kind of important to note about that is that it's seeking likelihood. It's seeking plausibility in its response. That's what it wants. And then it's basing that notion of what is plausible on the data that it has been given. And that's kind of how it can work. It might feel like we're sort of talking with something or texting with something that has the capability to think in the same way that humans do. And that's one of the tricky parts about this technology, is that it feels like it's a conversation partner. It takes your question, it understands what it is, and it gives you something back. But it's this very sophisticated operation of being able to understand patterns in vast amounts of existing language and reproducing to the degree that it understands that pattern based on your prompt. And there's maybe a couple of funny stories we could tell later to kind of illustrate that. But why now? Why is it now that this stuff is suddenly emerging, and that we have to deal with it? It's not that this technology is brand new. Folks have been working on this kind of technology for years. And in fact, chatbots for a couple of decades at least. And some people point all the way back to the ELIZA program in the 1960s as kind of the first effort to develop a chatbot. So there's kind of a long arc of development here. But what changed was that kind of in around 2017, 2018, there was sort of a paradigm shift in how the researchers developing this technology understood that they could do it. It was called the transformer architecture. What it means doesn't matter, but that's when the GPT-1 language model was released. And that was developed over the years into what became the language model that drove ChatGPT, which was released on 30 November last year. And all of a sudden, this is a concern because this has achieved a performance threshold. The previous models, GPT-1, 2, any of the tools based on those models were not sophisticated enough to achieve the kind of performance level that we are now seeing with the tools that are out there. And secondly, it was a public release for the first time with ChatGPT. Prior to this, the people who worked on these tools, it was kind of a niche thing. The engineers worked on them, the computer scientists worked on them. They were tools in very particular job sectors, marketing, advertising, et cetera, that would use these tools. But ChatGPT was the first completely openly available tool, with the small caveat, that you had to give it some information about yourself in order to sign up. However, it quickly became the most subscribed service ever in the history of anything on the internet. I think it gained in 2 days some kind of incredible number of users, perhaps in the millions. And since then, we have seen even more sophisticated language models be released, and we're seeing them integrated in other areas of the digital tools that we use. So for example, the Microsoft suite or the Google suite, the 365 suite, I should say, and the Google suite. And so that's why we're here now with these tools and why all of a sudden it has emerged at this moment. And I should note that the images I created for this slide are also using DALL-E. So there's a range, of course. We can do text and writing, text and coding, images, sound, and video. There's some really kind of interesting kind of bleeding edge work being done in video where these Gen AI platforms can take a still image and then generate a video from that image. So a lot of interesting things happening. The coding aspect is another thing to note, that these platforms have studied a lot of the openly available code that you can read on the internet and elsewhere. And that is being used in some more of the recent developments so that these platforms can actually generate things like data visualizations and analyses by writing their own code to analyze spreadsheet data, for example. But there are lots of concerns about how these things are developed, how they're used, et cetera. And when we're talking to students about these platforms, I think it's nice to be candid and open about why people are concerned about these platforms, given that students are likely going to be encountering this technology in whatever kind of career they go into, and it will continue to be ubiquitous. So how the models were trained, and this is just a concern already, and there are some lawsuits that will be decided about this currently in terms of the intellectual property around the data that was used to train all of these models. So for example, the GPT language model from OpenAI used a collection of sources, a lot of which came from the open internet to train them, a lot of which may have some intellectual property restrictions on them. And there's currently some kind of cases out there asking questions about that. There's implications for the intellectual property of using these platforms as well. OpenAI has taken the stance that anything that is produced with their platforms is not the property of OpenAI, but who knows what might change in the future or what kind of decisions might be made. There's kind of an evolving framework around understanding the property aspect of these tools. Data privacy and security is a big one, and this is one to stress at this moment that none of these tools, as they are FERPA compliant. And if you're using them for research as well, that if you have protected data for your research, that they are likely not very compliant for that as well. Anytime we put information into these platforms, we are giving that information to the organizations that are running these tools. And there's very likely a future, and people are working on this already, in which there are kind of fenced off versions of these tools that institutions might use, that organizations might use. So there could be a future in which, for example, the generative AI integrated into the Microsoft 365 suite is compliant with all of the regulations and other expectations here at UK. We may get there. And there's a strong incentive for the companies to develop that.
I would just want to add.
Yeah, go ahead, Jill. Yeah.
Just that with that in mind, with those ongoing questions about privacy, those are things that instructors should take into consideration when you're thinking about having students use AI. So you will want to not ask students to put private information into an AI tool. For instance, if you wanted to write a cover letter, you wouldn't want them to put their CV in there or something like that. And also, you might want to consider, those of you planning to use AI for assignments, an alternative or an accommodation for students who would like to opt not to use it, given you do have to sign up for a tool. Give it some information about yourself to sign up, that or maybe make arrangements for group work where people can pair up with others who do have an account.
That's a great point. Yeah. There's a lot of concerns around representation and bias, and this precedes the release of ChatGPT. There's a fairly influential paper called On the Dangers of Stochastic Parrots that was part of a big shakeup in Google's AI ethics division a few years ago. And it discusses this concern over who and what is represented in the data sets that these language models are trained on. Well, if you're using the internet, then likely it's going to be the people who have the biggest footprint on the internet in terms of whose information, whose language, whose stories, whose experiences, identities get represented the most in that data. This translates as well to visual AI. There's a concern, a sort of parallel concern around facial recognition AI right now, particularly as it's being deployed in applications such as TSA checkpoints. There was actually a really great article, kind of interactive article that just this week came out in Bloomberg about Stable Diffusion, which is one of the visual generative AI tools. And it's looking at that when you ask Stable Diffusion to generate images, they told it to generate all told over 5,000 images in their unofficial study. And they were asking it to generate images of different kinds of people, whether it's an architect or a CEO or different kinds of jobs. And they kind of analyzed using some existing frameworks for analyzing images of faces, what the trends were and who got represented as certain kinds of things and people according to Stable Diffusion. And they found some things that were interesting in terms of which ones were overrepresented for faces that read as male, or which ones that were overrepresented for lighter skin tone faces. And so it's a Bloomberg piece. I think if you just sort of Google Bloomberg Stable Diffusion, then it should be fine, or one of the CELT folks, if you can find that and put it in the chat, that would be helpful. Accuracy and misinformation. This is the big one to talk with students about, because, as I said earlier, the thing that these tools want, as strange as it is to say they want anything, is that they want to produce plausible responses that conform to the patterns they've learned. They've learned patterns in all the language and data that they've analyzed, and they want the response to conform, to be plausible according to that training that they've had. And the training is very complex. There's a sort of really long video from a Microsoft summit that explains it, that maybe we can share out as well to anyone who registered for this, as to how they train these things. But hallucinations is a term you may have heard, but for how these tools can get lots of things wrong, things that are a matter of fact. They can get facts wrong. They can also sort of be misleading, or they can fabricate things that don't really exist. One of the classic examples of this is if you ask it to produce citations for an essay, that it will fabricate potentially things that don't exist. It can make up a journal that doesn't exist. Or, and this is where it gets tricky, it might use the name of a person who really is a scholar in that area that you're asking it to write an essay about. But then it might make up a book that person never wrote, ever. Or and then is in my experience, if it's quoting them in the body of the writing, it might not be really a quote that they ever wrote or said. It's just something that was made up. Again, because it's seeking to make its response as accurate to the pattern that it understands. It's trying to guess which word comes next to make it as accurate to that pattern that it understands. A really good kind of illustration of this, and I'll try to tell the story very quickly, comes from a faculty in College of Engineering who told me the story, but that's they gave a Gen AI tool the Monty Hall problem, which, if anyone's familiar with the Monty Hall problem, it's that there's 3 doors on Let's Make a Deal. You're trying to get the car and the prize, and what happens? You pick a door, and then one of the doors that you did not pick is opened, and behind that door is something that you don't want, like a donkey or something very silly. And they say, well, okay, you've chosen door number 1. I just opened door number 2, and there's something behind it that you don't want. Do you still want to change your guess? And this is kind of a classic math thing, and I'm a humanist scholar, so I never got this in my education, but there's a reason to why you always say you switch your choice, always, in that case. And so anything that's ever been written about the Monty Hall problem on the internet is about how you should switch your choice. That's the response. And so this faculty was telling a story about how they gave the Gen AI platform the Monty Hall problem, but instead they said, you pick door number 1. They open door number 1. The car is behind door number 1. You've won the game. What do you want to do? And the response was, I change my choice. I want the other door. Because it's adhering to that pattern that exists in its training data, that there's so much writing in which they switch the door every time, it doesn't know how to not do that pattern. So that's kind of the difference in terms of it having the appearance of knowing things and making decisions and thinking, and how that's really kind of this after effect of the pattern that it's trying to generate based on the user input. So these are just a few of the big ones that have emerged. And we'll talk a little bit more about these as we get to the demo and some other resources. But ChatGPT, of course, is the big one. There's ChatGPT Plus, which is a paid for version, which operates on the more sophisticated language model, GPT-4, and it's connected to the internet. So as you're thinking about these tools and which ones you may want to use in your class, there's different kind of affordances and drawbacks. The free version of ChatGPT, not plugged into the internet, its training stops in the year 2021, so it doesn't know anything that happens after that. But GPT Plus, with the more sophisticated model connected to the internet, it has different capabilities. It can run code interpreters, so it can do data analysis and visualization, though I'm told by statisticians that it still hallucinates a lot, and so you need to check your work. And that's one of the things that we kind of recommend, that if you're going to use it in classes and talk with students about it, is that one of the virtues or one of the sort of rules that we shall not forget or stray from is that we always kind of verify what's coming out of this, not just in terms of factuality, but also in terms of, is this the best response even? Is this the best way of even responding to the prompt or the problem or task that I've set before it?
One other note about GPT-4 powered generative AI tools like ChatGPT Plus and Bing AI, while they are a little bit better at pointing towards sources, they still can mess those up, or they won't do in-text citations quite like you would want a scholar or a student to do.
Yeah. And so those of you that in that initial poll, we saw a lot of folks who are saying that they're going to use it with students on brainstorming, on generating an example so that students could compare it to their own, or these are all kind of really good ways, I think, to use it, because it's not asking it to just produce in total that final product. It's using as a tool, as an augment to thinking, rather than kind of this skip everything, collect $200, generate the whole essay.
Yeah.
All right.
So, I would say there's a couple of questions in the chat that can we pause for just a second, Trey, and do that?
Yep.
So Sarah's got a couple of questions asking specifically where does the information that is input into a prompt or a tool go? Is it publicly available or accessible? These are lingering questions. I've studied a little bit of the use policies of the three that were on the screen just now, and they all sort of list your typical internet tool disclaimer that, this is the stuff that we gather, your data, and of course we want to keep that private, but the internet. So there is not a clear picture really of where that input data goes, who has access to it, etc.
And you're always going to be at kind of the mercy of that organization's ability to keep its data private. Regardless of what the license agreement or privacy policy is. I believe there was an incident earlier this year in which some folks' prompts and actual chats with ChatGPT somehow were leaked or got out. So you're always kind of at the whim or the mercy of that kind of security. ChatGPT, I didn't check today. I mean, these things always change, but ChatGPT has had an option kind of buried in its settings where you can say, do not use the data I'm inputting to further train your model. Now, it's not about, they'll still have your data, but it's saying don't use it to train the model. So whether or not they actually do that, I don't know. But that is a good question of where the information is stored and can it be publicly accessible.
And then one more question. Is there concern about Gen AI having similar algorithms to social media, meaning sort of interpreting one's own tendencies or trends based on your content or input? I have a slight answer to that, but not a complete answer. I know that Snapchat has its own AI already and is developing that. And so I have no doubt that they will use your tendencies to make you want to use that AI as your go-to AI, because this is essentially a competition of soliciting users, right? This is why all these chat tools are coming out right now. Trey, do you have other things to add?
Yeah, I think it is just a general concern, and I had weaponization as one of the kind of big picture concerns that people have for Gen AI as a tool. Could this be weaponized for misinformation campaigns? Other uses that we've seen that similar to, let's say, Cambridge Analytica a few years ago, where we have already these social media type algorithms where it's all about isolating a particular type of perspective and content and amplifying it over and over again to drive user engagement. And it's certainly a possibility that these kind of tools could be folded into that larger kind of campaign. So yes, I think a concern for real.
So there are a few folks that indicated, I know nothing about AI, generative AI. We want to make just a few minutes available for demoing some things that might kind of help you become aware of its abilities, but also to give you some, ideas about how you might use it for learning in your class. And so this is Bing's chat, or the Bing AI that runs off of the GPT-4. It is connected to the internet, so it can generate current sources, but you have to be in creative mode in order for that to happen. These two are a little bit more restrictive. But I'm just going to insert a prompt that I pre-wrote that I wrote for a demo for athletic training. And it says, you're an expert. I'm telling it how to think, first of all, because that always generates a better output. You're an expert in the field of athletic training. I'm a collegiate athlete in track and field looking to improve my acceleration during a 110-meter hurdle event. Design a 6-week training program that allows for sufficient recovery time. So if I give it that prompt, then we'll wait for just a second as it's predicting a likely response to that. And as Trey has mentioned already, these tools don't think in sort of a broad essay type narrative. It's what's the right next word, or what's the right next character. And that is going to be, you might notice some trends. If you play with it long enough, you'll notice that it likes to have a few lists. It likes to, oh, this is new. It's giving me a little chart. Okay. It likes to offer listicle type things sometimes if that fits the prompt. I have not had Bing do this whole giving me a chart, which is interesting and kind of impressive to me right now. Notice here that it tells you this is one of 30. So Bing Chat often gives, well, this continues to write this very long training program for me. It gives you a set number of questions. And I was using it once for I was thinking it could be a really neat practice tool for students writing essays. So I teach history. Students read a graphic novel Mouse, and they have to do some analysis of that. And so I had it, I told it to, be an expert in war and society, write some essay questions for me that help me analyze these particular themes in Mouse. I'm going to then write the answers, and then I'd like for you to give me feedback based on these criteria, and then give me another question. And so it did it. We went back and forth a little. And it was actually a unique and sort of helpful exercise for me. Not for me as the instructor of the class, but it would have been helpful if I were a student and new to the process. Then when I went to do this for another session, Bing had suddenly changed the number of questions from 30 to 5. There had been problems with the server. Microsoft announced that people were able to, quote, confuse the bot, probably meaning it was behaving badly. And so they had to reduce the number of questions. So I thought, well, if this is the way it is, then my assignment or my study buddy essay thing is not going to work. But then they've since reopened it, and there's just not going to really be announcements about those things, I don't think. So keep that in mind if you're planning to use this. Let's take a look at our training program here. I am not a hurdler, so I won't be following this, but it gives you some interesting information here. And for those of you that maybe teach athletic training and might have a student do this, you might say, oh man, what am I going to do? You can also ask students to look and see, okay, well, what about this is wrong, or what about this is not great? You might need to take into consideration that the athlete has a herniated disc at their L4, L5, and they need to consider specific training in that regard. So, I might prompt it again and say, well, how might you adjust this plan for someone with chronic back injuries? And let's see if it adjusts the output. This is something else we suggest, is that encouraging students to remain engaged with the prompts and sort of question or push back to try to pull something different from the tool.
There's a great question in the chat that I think is worth kind of mentioning out loud, which is this is asked by Cottrell, but if you ask if two people use the same exact prompt, will it yield different results? And the answer is that if they use the same prompt on the same day, because these tools can change, from time to time, but same prompt on the same day using the same tool, then there will likely be some consistencies in the signposting or phrasing that the tool is using, but there will also be some differences because of the way that it's doing some fairly intense calculations around what words should come next, which will sometimes yield different results with some variations in there. Now, if it's, for example, somebody uses Claude and then with one prompt, and then they put the exact same prompt into Bard, then you'll likely get much different responses because those are two different language models that you're operating off of there. But if it's the same tool, there will likely be some-ish similarities with some differences as well. But if you were to take the same prompt and give it to the same tool each week for once a week for 3 months, you would likely see some variation over time in how it responds to that prompt.
I'm just entering the questions into the bots just for fun, so you all can see other responses.
So I'll highlight too what Shannon's saying in the chat. I think this is a really helpful move, that if you feel inspired to try these things out, that kind of putting material from your discipline into these tools is a helpful way to become accustomed to how they respond to it, whether it's material that you might have in a class or it's something from your research, and just kind of see how they think. How does this tool think with respect to the thing that I research and teach?
I also see another important question in the chat from Sarah, that asking if is there one source that it might pull from? No, that's why AI detectors are so limited in their ability to sort of prove that a student is pulling from some other source, because this is a predictive model and it's simply predicting the next thing that's coming. This is all novel content, so this is all new that it's generating, and so there's never going to be a report that says, here's, if you're used to Turnitin, it comes up with the plagiarism report where it tells you where these things come from, which websites. That's not the way this works.
There's Brad in the chat is also asking about, says minor question. I don't think too minor though, because I think everyone's asking about citation. That if we're going to use the output of these tools in some way, whether in teaching, whether for student learning, whether we want to use it for presentation, it's how do you cite it? So professional organizations have already moved to try to clarify this. From my corner of the world, things like APA, MLA, Chicago, for example, have developed some initial guidance around citation for large language models. I'm not as clear on the visual based, but the philosophy that you're taking in your response here of indicating the tool that was used, as well as, you say the author prompt writer. I've seen some people include the prompt. So the way that DALL-E actually leads you to cite it is when you just click a little button that says copy this thing, is it says DALL-E, and it gives the date. It's like a timestamp, and it gives the prompt that you put in to generate the image. So those three pieces of information for DALL-E were kind of important. But I think that's generally a good philosophy to take, is to kind of indicate the tool, perhaps when it was used, and some information about the prompt.
So I'm seeing some more questions about AI detectors. And so I'm going to use that as a great moment for us to shift over to the resources that CELT's worked to build out for you all. We released these, I think, on Tuesday. They're available to you now by just going to our website and then clicking on AI resources at the top. Our website, celt.uky.edu. And so there's a couple of different steps we're encouraging folks to take as they think through how they want to consider how to approach AI in the context of their teaching. There is an introduction to teaching with AI, or AI and teaching, whether you choose to allow it or not, where we define it. We have some interactive activities that you can do. These go to us, and you can click whether you want to be contacted by us or not. We also have these three principles. Trey touched on these, but I think these are important and will remain so as we go forward, about the constantly changing tendencies of these tools, the unclear ethics and impact, and then also encouraging everyone to come from the perspective of their own teaching style and discipline. And then lastly, in this intro, we talk about misuse and AI detectors. So one of the questions in the chat was, can Turnitin just tell us when AI is used? Well, it has an AI detector, but we do not recommend using AI detectors as the sole data point for determining whether a student has used AI to write something. And there are a number of reasons for this. As we've already mentioned, this is a predictive technology, so it's not pulling from one particular site or source, so you're not going to be able to prove with a report that here's where this came from. Also, there are some tendencies, and this is gone over in this intro that you can read as well if I'm talking too fast, or you're like, I'm just overwhelmed right now. There's also some tendencies for AI detectors to flag Grammarly. Some students who tend to, whose first language isn't English, are often cited as using AI, but that has to do with, think about predictive technologies and predictive text. It's sort of the average, it's the basic. And when I'm learning a language, I'm going to use the average and the basic forms of a language. And so that might trigger it as well. Trey, am I missing something else about detectors?
Well, generally too, there's what we're seeing with the organizations that are developing and using detectors is that there is not a lot of confidence right now in their efficacy among those organizations as well. The developer of GPT-0, which was the first detector out there, has kind of publicly indicated that he would like to take his company in a different direction from trying to detect AI written content. OpenAI also was working on its own. They called it an AI classifier. And in July, they very quietly shut it off. And they cited a low rate of accuracy as a concern and a rationale for cutting off access to it. Turnitin continues to have their detector. And there's emerging data showing that these detectors are both pretty easy to evade in terms of fooling them. And they're also prone to false positives for misidentifying when things are AI written. And one of the things I'll also note is that, depending on our view, let's say, we have different views of what's appropriate for the use of generative AI in our classes. There's the copy paste scenario where you would say, write my essay about this thing, and then you just copy and paste the whole thing and you put it in a Word document and turn it in. So that's a situation that the AI detectors are set up for optimally. But there's lots of other ways to use generative AI. You can use it as a way for summarizing information to get the big takeaways. You can upload a PDF to a Gen AI platform and ask it to give you in bullet points like the main takeaways of that text. You can ask it to do some calculations for you. You can ask it for some points that you should probably cover. You could draft something and then ask it to rewrite it for you for a different kind of audience and then edit it from there. And so there's lots of uses that aren't really set up to be, detected per se by these tools. So depending on whether those things are allowed in the class, the detectors are not really going to be set up to be looking for those sorts of use cases.
Yeah, we might also note that Vandy announced this week that they have opted to turn off the AI detection on Turnitin. So there is a switch there. At first there wasn't, but they have since added.
I should also mention as well that while there is a concern for data privacy and confidentiality with generative AI tools, there is doubly a concern for the detectors. And there's a future in which there's an internet full of sketchy websites that have APIs for detectors built into them, where you can just kind of go on to detectmyai.com and it's got a little text box on there and you can do a detector, and then it's just giving data to whoever owns that kind of website. So we also want to move away from that as well. And in GPT-0, for example, they have a privacy policy, but it's not something that's FERPA compliant. It's not something that is research compliant, compliant with protected research data.
So the other things that I would want to draw your attention to before we run out of time here is that, given that AI detection doesn't really work, and different people are going to have different stances on what misuse of AI is within your classroom, it's going to be really important to have an AI policy for your course. There are some recommended components of these policies, and these are all complement what the UK Advanced team has put out and what UK University Senate has put out. So definitely take a look at those documents as well. They're linked here. But defining what you're meaning as generative AI is going to be important for your content, your context. And then a clear statement about what is appropriate use. And we've got some examples, and they kind of fall along the flavors of what we had in that poll earlier, which is no use at all, some conditional use, whether it be based on in-class activities or certain assignments or certain tasks, and that sort of thing. And then if you are interested in an unrestricted use, we also have some examples. So all these examples are available with these drop downs, and you can use them however you like, pull them off and edit them, things like that. If you don't like our examples, which is fine, there is also a guide to writing your own, and this walks you through the questions of what to consider, how you might consider approaching AI in your own classroom. And for those of you that are, here's the links to UK Advanced Guidelines and University Senate Language. Those of you that are still kind of beginners and you're still trying to get your head around the different tools available, here's a breakdown of kind of what we said about ChatGPT being in those things. So those are all available to you. See a lot of
These
chat combo.
these tools were developed, these resources, as a complement, to the university Senate guidance around syllabus language as well. So be sure to check those out.
Mike, any questions from the chat that we need to?
Let's see. A question about ChatGPT, the free version, because I was listing off a lot of things. So for most of the things I was talking about, idea generation, having it rewrite things for you, etc., you can do that in ChatGPT. Now, ChatGPT, the free version 3.5, is going to sound different than ChatGPT Plus or Bing's AI because it's running on a different language model. It's going to sound, if you remember, like maybe what you heard people talking about last semester of like, well, it writes grammatically correct stuff, but it's kind of stilted. It sounds like really kind of formulaic. It's kind of basic, in the way that it sounds. It's vanilla. That's the kind of ChatGPT 3.5 way of producing output.
And one thing that you can do is try the different prompts in different. You can have free access to GPT-4 through Bing's AI, Bing's chat. So you can put a prompt there and then put it in ChatGPT, the free version, and that runs off GPT 3.5, and you can kind of see a general difference. Now, it might not be the exact difference if you had the free versus the paid version of OpenAI's ChatGPT, but it'll give you at least a general idea.
Some of the models are solely based on the large language models, and some have access to the internet as well. So, I mean, whether you're using Google Bard or others, right? Those are the other pieces. There's a lot of, you almost have to check to see which model you're using and what access it has, because it's becoming more complex with the neural networks that is built upon what it is given. So as it closes in on 1 trillion neural network pieces, its ability to think increases. That's
And Bard is connected to the internet, but it runs off a totally different generator or transcript. I forget something, whatever a GPT is. It runs off Palm 2, and it doesn't impress me quite often. It's got a long way to go. So
yeah. I think one last comment here. Cottrell says more students use ChatGPT, the more they'll begin to write their own responses like the ones given when they don't use it. So in essence, it's sort of like a writing tutor. So this is a good question to bring up here at the end in terms of pedagogy and teaching, and I'll allude to what I've referenced earlier, that in addition to hallucinations, we want our students to think critically about how these tools are outputting the responses. Like not just the info, but how they're doing it, how they're forming the responses, the choices they're making in putting the responses together. Are these the most optimal ways of addressing a task or a question in writing? And I think that's worth considering, because as Cottrell's pointing out, that, you could use this as a way to help you write, but you also want to be aware that this is just one choice as to how you could write in response to something among all the choices that you could make.
Yeah. So we are at time. I'm happy to hang around and answer questions for folks who just are trying to figure things out. Thank you guys for joining us. We'll make the recording available soon.